Moving from government to opposition's never going to be easy, but when you don't have an effective leader, you're going to make the job 10 times harder. The job of opposition is to hold government to account and point out their policies are not in the interest of British people and that your ideas are much better. But when you don't have direction, you just end up opposing everything. Yet when you've been in government for 14 years, a lot of things that are in place are your own policies. So without that leadership, you're just going to make yourself look silly opposing your own ideas. So here we have 5 times the Tories have been caught out strongly opposing policies they put in place.
Perhaps he can show more concern for the 1,100 people who found out yesterday that they could lose their jobs at Vauxhall's plant in Luton. So while he flies around making unilateral commitments, back home, the real-world effects are businesses closing in Bedfordshire and Basildon. Does the Prime Minister stand by his promise to ban the sale of petrol cars by 2030, even if more jobs will be lost?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't normally invite a heckle, but that one was accurate. Mr. Speaker, the question of the position of jobs in Luton is a very serious one, and families and workers will be very worried, and we are obviously engaging with them. I would remind the Leader of the Opposition that the EV mandates that are an issue in this particular case were actually introduced by the last government. I would also remind her that she was the business secretary that introduced them. We're getting on with supporting those communities. She's shouting from the sideline.
Stellantis told us as much when they said that this decision was made in the context of the zero emissions mandate. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders has said that the UK situation is particularly acute, with arguably the toughest targets and most accelerated timeline on the world. And there are unsustainable business costs undermining UK industry. The government's policy on zero-emission vehicles is a jobs killer. They say they've been talking since July. So why today, Mr. Speaker, this panicked U-turn when it's already too late? Under the last government, we acknowledged that the previous vehicle mandate was too stringent. We took the decision to push this back, recognising the impact that it would have on industry. We listened to Unite the Union on this. His party unilaterally reversed those changes and brought the deadline forward to 2030. Instead of Unite, he listened to the member for Climate Central in Doncaster North. But even today, the Secretary of State speaks of ending the sale of new purely petrol and diesel cars by 2030. He's tried to slip a subtle change in there, the consequences of which are significant. And whilst I welcome that for once this government has listened to business, he appears to be misleading them at the same time. Can he explain exactly what his policy is? There are real costs, as we see today, to these targets. When will the Secretary of State listen? When will his government abandon its attack on British business? Will he lead the charge to change course? And why won't he suspend the fines and targets which have led to today's tragedy?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, that is the single most dishonest statement I've ever heard in the time in this House.
I'm sure the honourable gentleman will be withdrawing that comment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to clarify some of the points the honourable gentleman raised on the other bench. The ZEV mandate policy is a...
We're on the same side. We'll be quiet, won't we? Secretary of State.
The ZEV mandate policy, the Shadow Minister mentioned, is a policy of the previous government, of which he is aware. The changes the previous government made were not to the ZEV mandate. They were not pragmatic on it. They changed the destination and kept the fines and the ramp-up and the thresholds exactly the same. So what they did was give no flexibility or pragmatism in how that policy operated, but still undermined the transition, leading to a massive reduction in consumer confidence. And he asks, has the honourable gentleman talked to industry? I was the guest speaker at the SMMT dinner last night. 1,000 people there from every bit of the automotive sector. They are absolutely clear that it's the destination they support. It's the Conservative government, the previous Conservative government's policy as to how this operates, which is causing them the problems. And as I said in the statement, if he was listening, or if he'd read it in advance, 10 days in to this government, we were told this plant was likely to close. It is on this side of the House that we've acted with pragmatism, been willing to look at any part of this policy in order to make sure this outcome didn't happen. The simple truth was that it was too late after 14 years of failure to be able to put this right. So I just have to say to him, with all politeness, he is out of touch with industry, he is out of touch with workers, he's even out of touch with what the previous Conservative government did, and I think that speaks for itself.
The Secretary of State has talked a lot about regaining global leadership, but I fear that he's stuck in 2009. He may not want to acknowledge this, but for the past 14 years we've been a global leader. We are the only major economy, the only one to have halved carbon emissions since 1990. In that same time, America's emissions have stayed the same and China's have tripled. However, what we have seen is that countries are not persuaded just because Britain is going further and faster. They're persuaded by prosperity and they're persuaded by living standards. We are 1% of global emissions, and if he continues down the path he set out, I fear that our country will face hardship and there'll be no point in being world leading because nobody will want to follow our lead. He would make us a warning, not an example to others. So let's start with what he announced at COP. The Secretary of State has set out a new target to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 81% by 2035. However, what we didn't hear in his statement is how much this will cost the British people. The Independent Climate Change Committee say that this target would require people to eat less meat and dairy, take fewer flights, swap their boilers for heat pumps and their petrol cars for EVs at a pace that will require taxes and mandation. Even the chair of the Select Committee has acknowledged people will be forced to change their lives. But the Secretary of State says not to worry. He'll deliver all the savings through energy policy, and those plans will lead to higher growth, cutting bills, creating jobs and strengthening national security. But none of those things are true when it comes to his plans.
Oh dear, oh dear. OK, let me deal with her questions such as they are, Mr. Speaker. Let's start with our nationally determined contribution announced at COP. Yeah. It's so interesting that she now opposes this, because the 2035 NDC announced by the Prime Minister is exactly the target her government legislated for in 2021 in the 6th carbon budget, which covers 2035, which means she is now opposing, Mr. Speaker, the very same target her government put into law. And she claimed that she was working towards as Secretary of State just a few months ago. And, Mr. Speaker, there is a pattern here. Every week, the Right Honourable Lady takes to Twitter to express her latest outrage about a policy, asking who on earth could support this. And every week, someone pops up in her replies and says politely, "You did, just a few months back." Because this isn't the only one, Mr. Speaker. Last week she came out against the clean heat market mechanism, another policy she proposed. In fact, I have a statement from her from only 8 months ago, where she said it will be coming in, the clean heat market mechanism, in April 2025, exactly what this government is doing. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, any passing bandwagon, and she'll leap on it, even if it means trashing her record. And let me give her a little lesson about opposition. The job of opposition is to oppose the government, not to oppose yourself. And this is where she has ended up. And so out of the window goes any commitment to climate action, ignoring the fact it's the route to energy security, good jobs and lower bills, ignoring the fact it's backed by business, ignoring the fact that this country has an honourable tradition of a bipartisan consensus. I'm happy to say that the last government proposed some ambitious targets, that COP26 was an important milestone for the world. And the truth is about this is it's not just irresponsible. It's not just crass opportunism. It's also actually what helped take the Conservative Party down to their worst election defeat in 200 years.
Justice has said that the courts are not operating at full capacity, perpetuating the record numbers in prison, on remand, awaiting trial. There could be an extra 6,500 sitting days if the government allowed them. Cases such as rape and sexual assault are being pushed into 2027. Baroness Carr warned the Justice Secretary that failure to maximise judicial capacity would actually cost the government more in costly and limited prison places. And yet the Justice Secretary failed to agree to her request. Why is the government letting out criminals rather than hearing more cases?
I'm tempted to remind the Shadow Minister about his own government's track record. He ought to know that it was my predecessor, his colleague, the last Lord Chancellor, who agreed the allocation for sitting days with the Lady Chief Justice, and that concordat agreement was concluded during the election period when the Tories were still conducting business. So perhaps he'd like to explain, when he responds, why the allocation was made for only 106,000 sitting days. What I have done, Mr. Speaker, is increase sitting days by a further 500 and increase magistrates' court sentencing powers, which is the equivalent of an additional 2,000 Crown Court sitting days, in order to start cracking down on that backlog.
Jenrick.
Instead of increasing sitting hours, the Justice Secretary's defining intervention in her 5 months in office has been to accidentally let out dangerous criminals from our prisons. And just last week, she rushed to Parliament to close loopholes she created for stalking, for disclosing private sexual images, and for murder. She could be signing deals with other countries to get new prisoner transport agreements. She could be using visa sanctions with foreign countries to force them to take back the 10,000 foreign criminals in our prisons. She isn't. Meanwhile, criminals are being released and are re-offending already. Will the Justice Secretary commit now to end her dangerous and unnecessary early release scheme?
Mr. Speaker, I do think the Shadow Minister could at least have apologised to the country for being part of a government and a party that ran out of prison places. It was the Tory party that ran the system at boiling hot, over 99% capacity, and I hate to remind him, but it was the Tory party that had their own emergency release scheme operating for months before the last general election, which did not have any exclusions for offences connected to domestic abuse. I'll take no lessons from him, because it is this government that is cleaning up the mess that his party left behind.
Now let me turn to the question of legal migration. And there I agree with her. The numbers have been far too high for many decades under successive governments. Now, it is welcome that the numbers for the most recent year have come down by 20%, but that is not far enough, and we need to go further. I do welcome the fact they're going to maintain most of the measures introduced by the last government that has seen that 20% reduction. We have also seen the number of visas go down. Visas, of course, are a leading indicator of net migration. Work visas down 28% year on year. Student dependents down 84%. Student visas down 19%. And care visas down 84%, all thanks to measures introduced by the last government. But I would like to know why this government has decided to suspend the planned increase in the dependent visa salary threshold up to $38,700. It was due to take effect in April of next year, but they have suspended it. If they're serious about reducing net migration, as she says, why have they suspended that measure announced by my right honourable friend, the member for Braintree, in December of last year? And if they're really serious about reducing net migration, as we are, what we really need is a hard cap on the numbers, proposed by the Leader of the Opposition and I last week. So will they follow our suggestion and introduce that hard cap?
I would just say the Shadow Home Secretary then sort of wriggles a little bit around the net migration figures that have gone up to this record high, 900,000, because of the new rules that they brought in, that his government brought in 2021. Who was the Immigration Minister who brought in those rules? The Shadow Home Secretary.
In another example, Tories are forgetting their past. Kevin Hollandrake thinks the public will vote them straight back in, yet the Leader of the House had a very festive way to point out their record, which you can see in the video that's on the screen now. Thanks for watching, don't forget to hit that like button, and I'll see you next time.